My grandmother comes from a family of 8, 3 brothers and 2 sisters. Growing up, they owned their own home, and although times got tough in those days, they managed to make ends meet and then some, playing it smart, working hard, and saving where they could. They grew their own food and canned for the winter, and bought furniture second-hand when a good deal came along. One such deal was a queen-sized wrought iron bed for close to nothing. It would be placed in the downstairs bedroom where the boys slept. They had the biggest room, but 2 of the boys were sardined into a full-sized bed at the time, so a queen would give them much-needed wiggle room. The bed was delivered to the house in the evening before dark and set up as Wednesday night church service was about to begin. My great-grandparents left the house immediately so they wouldn't be late, with 3 kids in tow. All the children, aside from my grandmother, her oldest sister, and youngest brother, they stayed behind to finish putting on the bedclothes and clean up. They didn't clean up right away, of course. First they jumped on the bed and threw pillows and caused a big stir. Her older sister scolded them, so they laid back on the new-to-them bed and stared at the ceiling and talked while settling down. When all at once the bed started to move. Not shake or bounce, but upwards. It felt so unreal at first, but in seconds it was hovering above the box springs, almost an entire foot in midair. My grandmother and her brother looked at each other in disbelief and froze. Then all at once, as if time sped up again, my grandmother squealed out, sending her older sister barreling into the room. She likely came to scold them again, but when she swung open the door, she couldn't believe her eyes. There was my grandmother and her brother, sitting on a mattress, floating above the bed frame. She stood in shock. Then all of a sudden, the bed dropped with a gentle thud. The kids screamed and jumped off of the bed and ran into the living room. Her older sister, still in shock, asked them what on earth they were doing, as if she was trying to gather her scattered thoughts to try to make some sense of what she'd just seen. The kids just kept screaming that the bed was floating on its own. An hour or so later, the rest of the family arrived home from church, and the kids explained to my great-grandmother what had happened. They were sure she wouldn't believe them, but to their surprise, she did. You see, the bed was purchased from a woman whose husband had passed away in that bed a few weeks earlier. My great-grandfather had felt odd about buying it. Not that he was a superstitious man, but it just seemed a little off-putting. But it was such a great deal and so needed, they went against their better judgment. My great-grandmother said the man's name was Walt Pig. That very night, the bed was taken out of the house and to the burn pit and discarded. They didn't ask for their money back, likely too embarrassed to repeat the story. But my grandmother never forgot the floating bed, nor the man's name to whom it belonged, and she told me to never forget his name, and I haven't. Number 2. When my mother was a teenager, she lived in a house in Lycans Creek with her mother, two brothers, and a sister. On some evenings, they would visit at the neighbor's house, where a lot of the kids in the area would go to watch TV and play records. Mostly teenagers, but sometimes a few younger siblings would tag along. To get to the neighbor's house, you'd have to walk across a long, open field with a trail down the center. The path was worn by all the tracks made by the kids going back and forth. And that evening, my grandmother stayed home, and my mother and her siblings took off across the field. You could see the neighbor's house in the distance and several other kids already on the porch. It was far enough away that you could make out the house and the porch light and shapes of people. They played music and hung out for an hour or so, and around sunset, one of the neighbor boys decided he wanted to go home and set off towards the path. Around that same time, my grandmother had come out to her yard and called for my mother and her brothers and sister to come home as well, her voice barely making it across the grassy divide. They were saying their goodbyes standing on the front porch, and the girl who lived at the house started pointing towards the field. They all turned and saw the boy who had left before them walking, but that isn't what the girl was pointing towards. Around the halfway point on the path was what looked like two glowing yellow eyes on the side of the path just out in the grass. My grandmother must have seen it also, from her side, because she started to call over in a frantic tone. You couldn't make out exactly what she was saying, but you could faintly hear, "Stay there." Everything seemed to turn chaotic. The teenagers were now all screaming to the boy to stop and come back. My grandmother was yelling from across the way. It was all so crazy, and all the while the boy paid no mind and only looked back for a split second in all the confusion, but kept walking ahead. The eyes started to move, and as the boy approached the middle of the field, they disappeared. He, none the wiser, crossed the path, and once on the other side, you could see him walking up his driveway into his house. He made it. My grandmother continued to yell across the field, and finally the girl's father came out and yelled back that he was driving them home. They all made it home safe that night. No one ever found out what was waiting in the field, and it was crossed hundreds more times over the years without incident. Was it a bobcat, or something more human? Or maybe something not human, and maybe something not animal. Number 3. My husband and I had been out one evening in the summer of '04 when we saw a hitchhiker thumbing for a ride. Now, normally I would never stop for a total stranger, but he looked older and tattered, and for whatever reason, my husband asked if I wanted to give him a ride. Before I even thought about it, I said sure and pulled over. The man walked up to the car and thanked us and got into the back seat. He smelled stale and was dirty and sunburned. He had on a coat, even though it was in the middle of the summer, with a plastic grocery bag tied to one of its buttons. He was talkative and friendly, and at first everything seemed normal enough. We asked how long he'd been out there and where he was headed, but he seemed to be sort of in his own world. He didn't answer the questions directly, and it didn't take long to realize something just wasn't right. We asked him again where he was going, and he only told us to keep on forward and go straight. It was right up there. I was starting to feel a little antsy, and I could tell my husband was too. He was steadily talking and raising his voice from the back seat. "Have you ever seen one of these?" he asked, pulling the plastic bag from his coat. Glancing in the rear view, I thought to myself, "A plastic bag? Of course I've seen one." But I answered, "No, what is that?" He then pulled out a knife with the thickest blade I had ever seen. My husband, who was sitting sideways in the passenger side, recoiled and threw his hand up as if to shield his face. "Whoa, buddy, what's that for?" he asked. The man smiled and said, "In case I ever have to kill something." That was it. I immediately started to get visions of him plunging that blade through the back of my seat. "Okay," I said kindly but forcefully. "We're almost to where we're going, so we're going to have to let you out here." I pulled the car over. He slid the knife back into the bag and got quiet. "I never said I was going to do anything to you," he said quietly. It didn't matter. He had to go. My husband then spoke up. "All right, man, we'll catch you later. Be careful now." He took the hint and exited the car. We sped off and breathed a sigh of relief. My husband apologized for even considering giving him a ride in the first place, and I made a joke about it. I was just happy to be safe and rid of the weird passenger. Needless to say, we never picked up another hitchhiker, and to this day, if we see someone with their thumb out, we look at each other and laugh and shake our heads. No way. Was he just a harmless old man, or did we dodge what could have been a very dangerous situation? We'll never know. Thank you for listening. Be sure and subscribe, hit the like button, and as always, sleep well.